Let's begin. So, what are Ramsey numbers? So, the multicolor Ramsey number in general, I am denoting it as R T1 to TL semicolon L, where L is the number of labels available to me, and I am considering edge labels of complete graphs. So, I will henceforth, whenever I mention labeling, I will mean edge labeling. So T1 to TL are L many positive integers, these are parameters given to us. And the Ramsey number corresponding to this set of parameters is just the smallest size of a complete graph for which every L labeling contains a monochromatic uh, complete subgraph of size Ti for some I from 1 to n. Okay. So the smallest n says that every L edge labeling of Kn contains either a complete subgraph of size K of size T1 with color 1 with label 1, or complete subgraph of size T2 with label 2, and so on up to L. Any one of these must be present. Okay. So that's the smallest such n is called the Ramsey number. We are concerned with a more specific case where we set T1 to TL to be a common number T. That's why they are called diagonal Ramsey numbers. And this is slightly easier to describe. It's the smallest size of a complete graph such that every L labeling contains some monochromatic complete subgraph of size T. Right? We are not specific about which color the monochromatic subgraph has or which label it has. Some monochromatic subgraph should be there of size T. That's all. So yeah, I think I will be interchanging this uh, terminology of labeling and coloring. Here we are anyways considering colorings which are not proper, okay, which is why labeling should be the more appropriate thing. But anyways, nowhere in this discussion are we concerned with proper colorings, and therefore I will use labeling and coloring interchangeably. So that's the basic definition of a diagonal Ramsey number. Let's just look at some very classical stuff that we already know. So the case when the number of labels available versus 2 assumptions a binary coloring is the first non-trivial case, and we just denote it as R of T. And Erudition Shekerish, by a very neat argument, gave the first upper bound of 2 to the 2t, or in other words 4 to the t on R of T. And the lower bound was given by Edish using the probabilistic method, and it's of the order of 2 to the t by 2. I'll put it that way. There are lower order terms corresponding to t, and there is a 1 plus t to lower 1 term, all those. But the key point here is that the lower bound that we know is of the order of 2 to the t by 2. Alright. So now, lower bound of order 2 to the t by 2, upper bound of order 2 to the 2t, there is a big exponential gap between these two points. And I think lots and lots of effort has gone into trying to bridge this gap with very bare minimum success so far. That's why any minute breakthrough is considered significant now in this direction. So further, some of the easy bounds that we know is that for general L, RTL has an upper bound of L to the LT, which is similar to the case when we have L equal to 2, where we have 2 to the 2t. And the proof for this is the same as that of Erudition Shekerish. And once again, on the lower side, again by using probabilistic method, Erudish showed that RT3 has a lower bound of 3 to the t by 2. Lefman came up with a very interesting recursive inequality, and this inequality will pop up again and again in this talk because it just helps us get lower bounds on the diagonal Ramsey number corresponding to a larger set of labels using smaller sets of labels. So RTL1 plus L2 is at least RTL1 minus 1 times RTL2 minus 1. And this is a very easy combinatorial argument where you just blow up a graph to get another graph. A very very simple exercise actually. One can think about this, and yeah, it should not take too much time to convince ourselves that this is true. So I'm omitting the proof of this. It's a very classical inequality by Huffman. What we did know from previous work is the following. For any L greater than or equal to 2, RTL has a lower bound of the order of 2 to the 79L by 300 the whole to the T. Okay, so it's 79LT by 300. There are lower order terms here and there corresponding to the constant C and then a little o of T term on the exponent. The constant is something that depends on L. So there are three cases of L modulo 3. When L is 0 mod 3, 1 mod 3, 2 mod 3. C takes different values. So, and the little ot term, I'm not even writing it here, although we do have specific descriptions of what those smaller order terms are. But as far as the basic asymptotics are concerned, we have a very large exponential gap to try and bridge, and therefore we really don't care about the particular descriptions of lower order terms at all. Which is why this is the most neat way of understanding the lower bound. It's 2 to the 79L by 300 plus some constant that depends on L. You could even ignore that. Asymptotically, this behaves very very closely to 2 to the 79LT by 300. Okay, that's the takeaway from here. This is what was already known until now. And the improvement by Conlon and Ferber last year is the following. First of all, the improvement is for L greater than or equal to 3, not for 2. For 2, their method does not give anything better than the previous bound that you already know. And the improvement here essentially is in the exponent from 79 by 300 times L. It has improved to 7 by 24 times L.
20, can you hide this black strip? Just try to.
Oh, is it coming? I didn't know that. Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Thanks. Yeah, okay. Alright, so from 79 by 300, the exponent improves to 7 by 24th. Well, does it really improve? You can use a calculator and check. And 79 by 300 is somewhere close to 0.26, and 7 by 24 is somewhere close to 0.29. So the improvement in the exponent is of the order of 0.03 times L whole raised to T. Okay. But nevertheless, the improvement, though so minute, is in the exponent, and therefore it is an exponential improvement. Okay. That is why it's considered significant, because we have a very large exponential gap in our understanding between the lower and upper bounds. And any minute improvement of an exponential nature is interesting because of just the difficulty that this problem has posed for such a long time. Okay, so this is the theorem that we are interested in this talk. Uh, I just want to say that the bound written here is a slightly, should I say, a neater version of the bound that they write down in the paper. In the paper, they are more explicit about the lower order terms, but just as I mentioned, for here, just for the purpose of comparing the improvement, I am ignoring the lower order terms by just pushing them inside the constant and the liquid factors. Okay. So, let's start with the main theorem. Just to recap, this is the statement of our theorem. How do we do this? So, the strategy is more or less the same. They do use Lefman's recursive inequality that we just saw in order to build upon the lower bound for higher values of L. But then there are certain basic values of L for which they do prove the result, and it turns out that for the base case, in some sense, the following is the main theorem that they prove. For any prime P, when you take a P plus 1 coloring, the Ramsey number corresponding to P plus 1 colors, there is lower bounded by 2 to the P by 2 times P to the 3T by 8 plus V below T. There are again some lower order terms which we will not get into. Alright, so the basic strategy is we will prove this for prime P, And then for all the integers that are between these primes, we will use Lefman's inequality and get lower bounds. Build upon whatever we know for the primes and then obtain them for the other integers. That is what is being done here. So far, am I very clear? Is everything fine? Okay, seems so. So let's go ahead. So explicitly, let's just look at what is the improvement for small values of L. When L is equal to 3, the Conlon-Ferber theorem, I'm calling it Conlon-Ferber theorem now, as compared to the previous known best lower bound, gives us an improvement of 1.834 to the t from 1.732 to the t. And for L equal to 4, the improvement is from 2 to the t to 2.135, very minute improvements. Okay. But nevertheless, exponential improvements. And that is what is worth noting down here. Okay, so let's get into the main theorem. Once again, this is the theorem statement for any prime t, rt p plus 1 has this lower bound. How do we do this? So we need a lower bound. What does it mean to get a lower bound? So if you go back to the definition of the diagonal Ramsey number, it is a least natural number n, such that every L coloring of Kn contains a monochromatic copy of Kt. Right? So what does it mean to say that the number on the right hand side is a lower bound? It means if you take a complete graph on these many vertices, the number on the right hand, then there must be an L coloring that does not contain a copy of K, a monochromatic copy of K. That is why it's a lower bound. The number on the left, the Ramsey number, is the least one that satisfies the property. Therefore, any number that's a lower bound, strict lower bound, must correspond to the negation of this property, right? And that is exactly what's happening here. So we need to prove that there is a p plus 1 labeling of Kn, where n is 2 to the t by 2, p to the 3t by 8 plus theta by t, that does not contain a monochromatic K, and we will be done. And here is where the fun starts. We will use some sampling process in order to do this. So we will actually show that for a random p plus 1 labeling on the complete graph with these many vertices, the probability that there is a monochromatic Kt is strictly less than 1. Okay. What does that say? Well, it says that the probability of there not being a monochromatic Kt is strictly positive, which means there must be at least one point in the sample space corresponding to which the probability mass is positive. So there must exist such a labeling corresponding to which there is no monochromatic Kt. That is what we want to prove. Okay. So this is just a probabilistic rewriting of what we would like to prove. If we can show this, then we are done. Alright, I hope this one is clear. Okay, so let's go ahead. So how do we do this? So now a little bit of technical stuff, but not too technical either. This is what I think what I really wanted to show you, which is that the techniques are fairly elementary here and very popular. There's no out of box thought or anything. It's just that they are put into place together in a very nice way and a non-trivial way, and they give you what you want. So let's start with a t-dimensional vector space over Fp and take the set V of all vectors in Fp to the t whose, so to speak, norm is 0. Since we are over Fp, we are working modulo p, this is not really the norm, but the dot product of the vector with itself is 0. We collect all such vectors. Okay. Why is this? Why are we calling this V? Well, the graph that we are concerned with, this will be the vertex set in some sense, and we will define edges using this dot product. So let's start with a very basic fact, which is that any element in Fp can be written as a sum of two squares. Okay, and this is a very classical result, very basic result, almost everyone knows it. But let me just quickly mention a very neat proof of this using another very interesting result. So how do we show this? Well, for t equal to 2, it's obvious. So let's take t greater than 2. Therefore, t is now odd. Right? And let S sub t be the set of all squares in Ft. Then one can check that Sp has size p plus 1 by 2. That's very easy to check. Okay, because if you look at all non-zero squares, they will partition Fp into elements of two sets of the form a comma minus a, and then counting them you can get that all the non-zero squares will have size p minus 1 by 2, and then there is 0, so it becomes p plus 1 by 2. Okay. So Sp has size p plus 1 by 2, and we just get down to this very cute result by Cauchy and Davenport, which is that if you take any two subsets of Fp, then the size of the sum set a plus b is at least the minimum of t and size a plus size b minus 1. Okay, it's a classical result. There are several proofs for this. One particularly neat proof was given by Alon using the combinatorial Munsell exams. So if anybody is interested, they can look it up. It's a very clean 5-line proof or something, very easy. So how do we use this? Well, the fact that we are looking to express an element as a sum of two squares essentially translates to asking whether an element belongs to the sum set Sp plus Sp. Okay. And simply by plugging in the parameters that we have, we get that the size of Sp plus Sp is at least p. But Sp plus Sp is a subset of Fe with size of least p, so it has to be the full set Fe. So every element is expressible as a sum of squares. Okay. Why are we interested in this? Well, once we have this, we know that if you take any arbitrary t minus 2 scalars v1 to vp minus 2 in Ft, and you take the sum of their squares, okay, then it's an element of Fp, and you can always find some vt minus 1 and vt such that vt minus 1 squared plus vt squared is the negative of this sum of squares, and therefore you can always hook up a vector v with these components such that the dot product is equal to 0. Right? But then our degrees of freedom were in the first t minus 2 components. We could have chosen them to be anything. Therefore, there are at least t to the t minus 2 such elements in V. Right? That's what we wanted. So size of V is at least t to the t minus 2. Because anyways a subset of Fp to the t, so it has size at least t to the t. Okay, that's obvious. So this is the takeaway from this slide, that the size of the set is at least t to the t minus 2. Okay. So what do we do with this set V? As I said, it's the set of vertices of a graph. So which graph are we talking about? The complete graph itself. The vertex set now is this set V. And what sort of colors do we get, or what sort of labels do we give to the edges? So now we'll again look at the dot product. So all of this dot product is modulo P, as you would have understood, although I'm not writing mod P all the time. So the colors that we give are as follows. For any edge UV, if u dot v is non-zero and takes the value I, then give it the color I. Right? And if u dot v is 0, which means in Ft it is 0, then you give it either p or p plus 1, but then you do it independently and uniformly at random. Okay? You give either p or p plus 1 with probability half. So there is a slight random element to the edge labeling right here. And now we will actually see that there is more randomness involved in the final construction. Once we do this, something is very easy to observe, which is that when you look at this labeled graph KV, corresponding to any label between 1 and t minus 1, if you look for monochromatic complete subgraphs, then there cannot be any monochromatic subgraph with size strictly greater than t, as long as you restrict your attention to labels between 1 and t minus 1. Okay, and once again I should say this is an easy case because it's only the statement that seems a little involved, but I'll say this is easy because the vertices are vectors and therefore we can use a slight linear algebra component here. So this is a straightforward one line follow up to the fact that when you take any s many elements, which is the vertex set of a complete graph AS, they are linearly independent. Okay, and since they are linearly independent in a t-dimensional vector space, this S cannot exceed t. That's all. Okay, proving that they are linearly independent is again super easy because you are working with very well understood vectors. Their description is neat. No problem. So it is easy, although the statement looks a little bit convoluted. It's just a verification that a set is linearly independent. Nothing more than that. So I am skipping the proof of this fact. But let me comment on why at all should we look at the statement. There is no monochromatic complete subgraph of size greater than t. So here's the following. We did introduce one element of randomness in labeling the edges UV where the dot product of U and V is 0. Right? Now, here's the thing. This complete graph, the overall complete graph that we are considering on the vertex set B is quite large. The number of vertices is p to the t minus 2. Turns out that it is not very reasonable to expect that in this complete graph you will not have a monochromatic KT. There may be many actually. So here's the thing. How do we come up with a construction which guarantees that for a certain coloring there is no monochromatic copy of KT within that? And the idea is we start with this large complete graph on the vertex at B and we take a small random subset of B and look at the restricted complete subgraph on that subset. Now if the random subset of B that we take is small enough, then within that random subset we will not find a monochromatic copy of KT with high probability. The probability does come because we are talking about random subsets. Okay, so one needs to restrict oneself to a small subset, small enough subset of B, such that when you look at the complete graph on that small subset with high probability, there will not be a monochromatic copy of K. That is the idea. Okay, so that small subset that we take, the small complete subgraph that we take, that is our final construction. Okay, this is just a setup. The graph KB is just a setup. So what do we gain by showing this case? What we say is that the following bad event does not occur, which is suppose there are monochromatic copies of complete graphs with size much greater than t. Suppose that's possible. Then there is a chance that even after restricting to a small subset, this very large monochromatic complete graph gets restricted to a complete graph which is monochromatic of size t, which is what we would like to avoid, right? So if there are very large monochromatic graphs, then upon restriction they could actually go down to a monochromatic graph of size t. We would like to avoid that, and we are actually saying something very strong when we claim this. We say that there is no large monochromatic graph, and by large, nothing of size anything greater than t. Even t plus 1 is not possible. Okay, therefore when we restrict to a smaller subset, we are guaranteed that with a high probability we will avoid monochromatic KTs. Okay, that is the significance of this statement. So I hope that I am making sense. So I think this is a good time to pause because the next case is essentially the final nail on the proof and slightly hold. So up to this point, if there is something that's not clear, I am open to taking questions. Hello, I'm open, I'm wondering. Yeah,
Yeah,
Okay, so if there are no questions, let's go ahead. So what's the next case? We have looked at labels corresponding to 1 to p minus 1. What we're left with is p and p plus 1. Right? Are there monochromatic copies of kt corresponding to labels p and p plus 1? That's the question. So here we need to do a little more work. What we are going to do is, we are not going to straight away narrow down our attention to monochromatic subgraphs, monochromatic complete subgraphs. Instead, we will look at first a larger class of subgraphs which could potentially be monochromatic complete subgraphs. Okay? So, any subset of X, any subset X of V is said to be a potential clique if X has size T and the dot product of any pair of elements is 0. Okay? The size being T condition should be clear, because finally we are concerned with avoiding cliques of size T. The dot product being 0 is specifically because now we are talking about labels which are either P or P plus 1. And if you're looking at a copy of KT that is monochromatic, where the label is either P or P plus 1, then the dot product of any pair will be equal to 0. Right? So this is a larger class of, you can think of this as a larger class of subsets of vertices, where we are not yet insisting that it should be a monochromatic clique, but we are covering all cases which could potentially be monochromatic cliques. Okay, this is a larger class. And now we are going to say that this larger class itself is small. Okay. Once we say that, then definitely the chance of finding a monochromatic clique becomes very, very small. And therefore there will exist at least one coloring which avoids monochromatic cliques. That is a strategy. Okay, so let's start again. X subset of V is a potential clique if X is size T and the dot product of any pair of vertices in X is 0. And let Mx be the matrix corresponding to this. So V is a subset of a t-dimensional vector space. So every element here, every vertex here is a vector. So let's just arrange them as rows of a matrix, and let me call it M's of X. Okay. We are taking this in some order. We don't care what the order is, but there is some order. Now the fact that u dot v is equal to 0 gives us this condition in the matrix language, which is that Mx is self-confident. Mx times Mx transpose is 0. Okay. What do we do with this? So now suppose a potential clique X has rank R, then we also fix this convention that we will rearrange rows to make sure that the first R rows are linearly independent. That's a condition we put in the construction of Mx. Okay. Why does it help? It helps because now we get a better hold over the count of X. So the number of such potential cliques with rank R is now at most the number of T cross T matrices Mx of rank R having first R rows linearly independent. Okay. First of all, Mx will be a T cross T matrix. Hello?
Are you saying that X is a subspace?
No. Just the subset. Just the subset.
Subset, just a subset. So rank this. Let X be a potential clique with rank R. What is it?
So
Rank of Mx.
rank of Mx, yeah. I should have clarified that this time. So the rank is corresponding to the matrix. X is just a collection. You could think of it as a collection of rows. I put those rows together, I look at a matrix, and then I calculate its rank. That's what I'm doing here. Okay? Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I should have clarified. Thanks. So the rank corresponding to the rank of the matrix, and this is the convention that we fixed, which is that the first R rows are linearly independent. And now if you see, X is a subset of V, but calculating matrices whose rows come from V is a little difficult, because V is not a very neat subset in that sense. But we can always upper bound it by the count of matrices satisfying this property, where the rows are not restricted to be in V, they could just be from the vector space. Right? Therefore, the number of such potential cliques of rank R is at most the number of T cross T matrices Mx of rank R. having the first r row linearly. And it's t cross t because t-dimensional vector space is the length of every vector is t and the size of x is t. So there are t rows. So now can we count the second quantity? The second quantity is very easy to count. So the number of such matrices, this is a common algebra calculation that we have done several times over while trying to compute the size of GLN FQ, or yeah, this is a more general version of that where you try to compute number of matrices with a certain rank. So I'm not going over how we get this computation, it's fairly straightforward. The number of such matrices turns out to be this product on the left. But then when you simplify this, it turns out to have a very interesting quadratic expression in R, the exponent of t. This is what it is. Now once again, t to the quadratic in R is again slightly difficult to handle. So what do we do? So far we have this. The number of potential cliques, let me just call it n sub t, is at most this expression t to the quadratic expression in R. But now, well, let me just go and upper bound it more freely. The quadratic expression attains a maximum. It turns out that if you apply usual calculus, it will attain a maximum at t by 2. Plugging in r equal to t by 2 gives me this final expression phi t square by 8 plus some smaller order terms in t square, little t square. And this is my final upper bound that I'm going to use on the number of potential peaks. If you see, it's a quite weak upper bound because we have weakened the upper bounding process twice. Once while considering matrices over the vector space instead of over V, and now second by maximizing. But it's all right. Things still work. That's a nice thing about it. So now comes the final sort of step. The lower bound n that we are aiming for is 2 to the minus t by 2, t to the minus 3t by 8 is equal to t. And let me just fix a number alpha to be n by 2. Okay, this will be a number less than 1. In fact, it looks like n by t to the t plus a constant in the exponent. It's p to the minus t, so p to the t comes below, and there is a small constant term in the exponent remaining, which we don't really care about much. So this alpha is actually a number between 0 and 1, and the final random subset that we pick is actually chosen as follows. We take a random subset of P by picking each element of P independently with probability alpha. Right? Every element or every vector in V or every vertex in V has the same probability alpha of being chosen into this random subset, and this choice is independent. So the choice of one element does not influence the choice of another element. Okay? This is the random subset that we're going to pick. Now once we have this random subset, what is the expected number of monochromatic potential cliques that we get? So let me just quickly explain what is the first term here onto there. So alpha to the t is the probability of getting a clique of size t, right? And now there are t choose too many edges, and 2 to the 1 minus t by 2 is the probability that it is monochromatic. Okay, but now once again we said that the number of potential cliques is upper bounded by this quantity, the quadratic expression on the top, and therefore this is an upper bound of nt. So there are ntv choices, right? So when we take the expectation, this is exactly the left hand expression. The expected number of monochromatic potential cliques is exactly the left hand expression, and now we have upper bounds for each. So just plug in all those. We get a complicated expression, but simple to handle. Eventually, all of this computation boils down to finally getting 2 to the minus t by 2, t to the minus 3t by 8 plus equal to t times n whole to the t, and this is where we get the choice of n. Okay, it's like a back calculation. So we want this number at the end to be less than half, less than a constant that is less than 1. That's what we need, but we just choose it to be half. We need it to be less than half, and therefore we need to choose n to be the this particular expression, exactly this particular expression. Okay. Once we do that, we get this. Therefore, there is a choice of subset. So what have we shown? This expected number is less than half, right? So the probability of getting a monochromatic clique is less than the probability of getting a monochromatic potential clique. That itself is less than half. Therefore, there is a choice of a subset of size n, such that there is no monochromatic potential clique even, and therefore there is no monochromatic clique either of size t. Okay. So that's the final conclusion from this probabilistic analysis, and that concludes the theorem, as we have seen. The last line says that we are so that's the formal end of this talk. And in the abstract, I had mentioned a little bit about an improvement by Yuval Dickerson, but the construction is slightly different. They do follow more or less the idea involved in Conran and Ferber, but the construction becomes slightly more involved. So I'm just skipping all of that. Nevertheless, I'll just say that their improvement in the exponent is again by a factor of 0.02% in the exponent. That's all. In the case when the number of labels is greater than or equal to 2. So yeah, that's the conclusion. So I think I'm open to questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Venkatesh, for the interesting talk. Yeah, audience, if you have any question, can ask now. What about that references, Venkatesh?
Oh yeah, so there are only two references as such for this. So this is the paper by Conlon and Ferber 2020,
Mhm.
and then there is another by Victorson. So once again, I just mentioned in the chat, mentioned it in the slides. So Conlon and Ferber, I think this came up in October, and then Yuval Victorson followed it up in December. Essentially the same set of ideas and same set of techniques in the proof, just a slightly different construction.
Ah, okay, great.
And yeah, the titles are all the same. Improvements in the lower bounds for multicolor Ramsey numbers. The titles are the same, so
Okay,
it's
okay, yeah,
easy to find.
okay. Sajid also, I think, mentioned the paper in our.
Sajid has given the link.
Yeah, I sent that archive link.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, I think there is a question.
Is there a question?
Jigyasa.
Yes, Venki, can you go back to your presentation?
Yeah, I'll do. Yeah.
Maybe on third or fourth slide there was a statement.
Stop me, yeah, I'm just going ahead.
Yeah, here only. You have said
Yeah.
that Ramsey T L is greater than equal to this quantity. Is this
Yeah.
true for any L, or is this true for L of the form some prime number plus 1?
No. That's what I said. So they basically prove this for prime number plus 1. Okay, that's the main theorem. Okay, that's the statement that I have below.
Right.
Okay, now assume the statement for t plus 1 colorings and just go back to this recursion inequality that I have, Lefman's inequality. Using this inequality, see now there are infinitely many primes and they are spread out. So for in-between numbers, you can go to the lower primes
Right.
and get a hold of that. Okay, That is what they're doing. So once you do that, more generally for L, you can write down this. Okay. So in that sense, if you see this lower bound is slightly weaker because this works
Yes.
for every L.
Yes. So this is not exactly the theorem statement.
Well, this is the theorem statement exactly because what I've done here, so in the paper they just give three different expressions for n equal to 0 mod 3, 1 mod 3, 2 mod 3.
Right. But we can find it for any interval. That I understand.
Yeah, but you can just put them all together and write them in this form. They are equivalent statements.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is, if you take L to be p plus 1 and look at the bound above, that might be slightly weaker than the bound below because there is a loss that comes from left hand.
Yes. That is.
Okay. Yeah. But that's a very slight loss. That loss gets covered in this little ot in the exponent. That's not too much. So as far as exponential improvement is concerned, you don't lose anything even with that loss.
Fine. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yeah. Are there other questions?
Or comments or anything? I think I have few more minutes, so if something is not clear, I am open to going through
Yeah. Yes.
few
Yes.
slides again. That's also okay.
Okay. I think if there is no other question, let us thank Venkatesh. Yeah. Thank you, Venkatesh.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.